They thought I'd never return. While I was deployed overseas, sleeping in sandstorms, eating dust for breakfast, and dodging bullets, the Homeowners Association sold my family ranch out from under me. My land, my legacy. Gone with the swipe of a pen and a Smug signature. When I came back, they smiled in my face like nothing happened, sipping lattes and quoting bylaws. What they didn't expect, I wasn't alone. The army doesn't abandon its own. And when soldiers come home to find betrayal, they don't just take back land, they take back every house that injustice built. This was war. The land had a voice of its own, and I grew up learning its language before I ever learned to write my name. The creak of the windmill as it turned with the prairie breeze, the low bellow of cattle across the pasture at dawn, the soft crunch of boots on dirt that had been walked for generations, those were the sounds of home. My ranch wasn't just acreage fenced with barbed wire, it was a living inheritance, passed down from my grandfather, who broke his back plowing fields by mule, to my father, who modernized it with sweat and machinery, and finally to me, the son who swore never to let the soil go untended. Every fencepost told a story, every creek bend carried a memory. The ranch was more than land. It was the spine that held my family upright. Mornings on the ranch began before the first shade of pink touched the sky. I'd roll out of bed to the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, brewed by habit as much as necessity. Before the world outside my county line knew I existed, I'd already have a rope in my hand and dirt on my jeans. There was a rhythm to it, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, moving the herd from one pasture to another, fixing what needed fixing. That's the thing about ranch life, you never really finish. There's always something broken, something hungry, something waiting. But the work never felt like a burden, because every nail I drove into old wood and every bead of sweat I left in the soil carried the weight of legacy. I was keeping my father's promise alive, and his father's before him. The community respected that. In small towns, respect doesn't come cheap, and it isn't handed out with a smile and a handshake. You earn it the long way, by showing up when storms knock down a neighbor's barn roof, by lending your tools without expecting them back, by sweating side by side during harvest. My ranch was part of that fabric. People knew me as a worker, a man who kept his word, someone who looked out for others. The land wasn't just mine. In a way, it belonged to everyone who had ever relied on its cattle, its hay, its quiet strength. We trusted each other back then. Contracts were written on calloused hands, sealed by eye contact. If someone shook your hand, you could bet your life on it. That was before the law came creeping in like weeds after a spring rain. At first, the Homeowners Association looked harmless, almost laughable. A group of middle-aged transplants from the city who'd bought parcels of land nearby, eager to trade cubicles for wide skies. They wanted order, neatness, symmetry, things that don't always belong on a ranch but thrive in manicured suburbs. They didn't understand that dirt roads wash out in storms, that cattle leave messes where they please, that barbed wire isn't decorative but survival. To them, the countryside was a blank canvas they could control with newsletters and bylaws. To us, it was life, messy and unpredictable. I remember the first meeting I was dragged into, held in the community center, a building that used to smell of rodeo dust and barbecue but now reeked of potpourri and disinfectant. The HOA president, a wiry man with perfectly combed hair and teeth too white to have chewed real beef, stood at the front with a clipboard. His voice carried the same smug tone as a boss who never lifted a hammer but still told you how to swing it. "We're just trying to bring some order to the community," he said. "Uniform fencing, consistent mailbox heights, landscaping guidelines, it'll improve property values for everyone." I nearly laughed out loud. Property value? My ranch wasn't for sale. It wasn't a house you flipped after 5 years and a coat of paint. It was a heritage. My cattle didn't care if the mailbox was painted beige or brown. But the others nodded, politely, some even clapped, because nobody wants to look unreasonable in a crowd. That's how the HOA worms in. They dress control in the costume of community improvement. For a while, I ignored them. Let them fuss about mailbox heights and lawn decorations. I had fences to mend and cattle to feed. But then the letters started showing up. One accused me of non-compliant fencing materials. Another said my equipment yard was unsightly from the road. My favorite was the one about livestock odor exceeding acceptable limits. Livestock odor. On a ranch. That was the day I realized they weren't just playing neighborhood dress up, they were targeting me. See, my ranch was the biggest property in the area, and the HOA wanted influence. My land wasn't just land to them, it was leverage. If they could pressure me into submission, they could claim dominion over everyone else. They used words like zoning concerns and community vision, but I knew what it really meant: control. They saw my open pastures as wasted potential, a place for subdivisions and cul-de-sacs, not cattle and horses. And I could see the hunger in their eyes when they talked about it. The conflict simmered like a pot left on the stove too long. On the surface, we were polite, handshakes at the grocery store, nods at the post office. But underneath, we were circling each other, waiting for the first strike. They sent more letters, each one more absurd than the last, threatening fines for everything from barn paint color to the unapproved vehicle parked in my yard. That vehicle was a tractor older than half their board members, but to them it was an eyesore. I stopped answering, stopped acknowledging. I wasn't about to bow to people who thought cows should come with deodorant. But I'll admit, part of me underestimated them. I thought they were just bored busybodies, the kind of people who needed to feel powerful because life had otherwise ignored them. I didn't see how far they were willing to go, how much time and money they were willing to throw at the dream of carving up my ranch into something they could stamp their names on. I didn't see that while I was pouring my sweat into the land, they were pouring ink into paperwork, laying traps in legal jargon. I should have seen it coming when the letters changed tone. They weren't just threats anymore, they were formal notices, citing codes I'd never heard of and bylaws nobody had voted on. They started showing up with dates, deadlines, penalties. It was all dressed in the language of legality, but underneath it was the same rotten smell of control. My neighbors warned me. Some said, just play nice, fix a fence, paint a barn, show them you're willing. But others knew better. They told me what the HOA wanted wasn't cooperation, it was compliance. And once you gave them an inch, they'd take your whole acre. Still, I clung to faith. Faith in common sense. Faith that no group of clipboard warriors could stand against tradition, against a man's right to work his own land the way his father did. I trusted that the roots of my ranch were too deep to be dug up by bylaws. But as I looked at those letters piling on my kitchen table, a quiet unease settled in the back of my mind. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like the first chill before a storm, when the sky turns strange and the wind carries a warning. The HOA was circling, waiting for me to slip, waiting for the day they could pounce with their rules and regulations. And though I didn't know it then, that day would come when I least expected it, when I was half a world away, fighting battles that had nothing to do with mailboxes or lawn height. Back then, though, I still had mornings of open pasture and evenings under the wide, forgiving Texas sky. I still had the ranch that raised me, the soil that smelled like freedom, and the belief that land meant loyalty, that a man's home was untouchable. What I didn't know was that the same soil I trusted to hold my roots steady would soon become the battlefield where trust, legacy, and betrayal collided. And when the first crack appeared in that foundation, it wasn't the weather or the work that caused it. It was the HOA, already sharpening its knives under the pretense of community spirit. And so the stage was set. Me, the rancher soldiering through days of honest work, blind to the trap being woven in committee meetings and printed on official letterheads. Them, the smiling neighbors with hidden teeth, already plotting how to sink their claws into the land that had been my family's lifeblood for 3 generations. Looking back, it feels almost inevitable, like a story written long before I was born. A man fights for land, and someone else always wants to take it. But at the time, all I saw was home. Home, and the quiet promise that nothing, not storms, not droughts, not petty neighbors with too much free time, could ever take it away from me. I was wrong. War has a smell, and it never quite leaves you. Burnt fuel, gun oil, sweat baked into uniforms, dust that grinds into your teeth no matter how many times you spit. It clings to your skin, seeps into your bones. That was my life overseas, half a world away from the green pastures of home, standing in deserts that stretched wider than any horizon I'd ever known. The sun there didn't shine, it punished. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until the only thing keeping me steady was the thought of the ranch waiting for me back home. Every mission, every mile, every scar carved into my body, I told myself it was worth it, because somewhere across the ocean my land still stood, my cattle still grazed, and my family name was still stitched into the soil. But war doesn't pause for nostalgia. Mornings came in the form of reveille shouted too early, boots stomping across gravel, engines roaring to life in the motor pool. Nights came with tracer rounds streaking across the black sky like angry fireworks, each one reminding us that someone out there wanted us gone. There were days when the adrenaline surged so hard I thought my chest would burst, and nights when silence fell so heavy it made me restless, because silence in a war zone is never just silence, it's the calm before something breaks. Still, soldiers learn to adapt, even find humor in the absurd. We laughed at the sandstorms that swallowed entire convoys, joked about chow hall meals that could double as doorstops, and placed bets on who could outlast the heat in body armor before collapsing. That's how you survive, humor sharp enough to cut through the darkness. My buddies knew me as the rancher, the cowboy who talked about cattle and barbed wire as if they were people. They teased me mercilessly, asking if my cows were sending me letters or if the WA back home was grading my fence lines while I fought insurgents. I laughed along, because the idea of those petty WA types bothering me while I was out here seemed too ridiculous to be real. But jokes have a way of turning into omens. Mail was slow, unreliable, but eventually, letters made their way across oceans. Most were from my sister, who looked after the house when I was gone, though she didn't have the time or energy to run the ranch. Her words were usually warm, filled with small-town gossip and reminders that the cattle missed me, her way of keeping me grounded. But then came the envelope with the neat, bureaucratic lettering. Not her handwriting, not family, cold ink from back home. The first notice from the HOA. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Violation of community guidelines, non-compliant structures. I read it by flashlight in my tent, surrounded by the sound of snoring men and distant mortar fire, and I actually laughed. Structures. My barns had stood longer than most of those WA board members had been alive. Still, I folded the paper and tucked it away, figuring I'd deal with it when I got home. After all, what could they possibly do while I was over here? The next letter wasn't so easy to dismiss. It came weeks later, thicker, with more pages clipped together, every one of them bristling with legalese. Words like liens, foreclosure potential, community zoning authority. I wasn't a lawyer, but even in the dim light of a combat outpost I could smell the trap. They were laying a paper trail, building a case. I showed it to one of my buddies, a former law clerk turned infantryman, and he shook his head. They're trying to bury you in bureaucracy. Classic move. You ignore long enough, they'll take everything. Everything. That word dug deeper than any bullet ever could. I tried writing back, but mail routes were unpredictable. Weeks would pass before letters reached stateside, and longer still for replies. I sent instructions to my sister, told her to keep every envelope, every notice, don't throw anything away. She did, but she also wrote back in frantic script, they're serious. They've started showing up at the ranch. Meetings, hearings. They talk like you've already lost. The absurdity of it all struck me hardest when I realized what was happening. Here I was, a soldier sworn to protect my country, dodging sniper fire in a desert, and back home a group of middle-aged busybodies with clipboards were working to steal my ranch with signatures and stamps. I fought enemies I could see, men with weapons and intent. But this enemy, they hid behind bylaws and city council smiles, striking from the safety of conference rooms. And somehow, that cowardice felt more dangerous. I couldn't fight them, not from here. Every ounce of discipline drilled into me screamed to focus on the mission, to keep my brothers alive, to survive. But at night, lying under a sky littered with stars too bright for comfort, my mind always wandered home. I pictured strangers walking my pastures, tearing down my fences, paving over my cattle trails. I pictured the ranch swallowed whole by their community vision, the kind of vision that erased history for the sake of uniformity. Each time I thought about it, the anger rose higher, hotter than the desert sun. The war around me became tangled with the war waiting at home. I couldn't separate them anymore. Each firefight blurred with imagined battles at the ranch gate, each order shouted by my sergeant overlapped with the smug voices of WA board members. And somewhere in the middle, I felt powerless. A soldier in a war he didn't choose, fighting on two fronts, one with bullets, one with signatures. Then came the letter I'll never forget. My sister sent it with shaking hands, the ink smudged where her tears had fallen. They've filed the papers. The ranch is being auctioned. They say you've been absent too long, that you've forfeited by non-compliance. Auctioned. The word punched the air out of my lungs. I sat in that tent, surrounded by the distant thud of artillery, and for the first time in years, I felt hollow. It wasn't just land they were taking, it was the ghost of my father's calloused hands, the echo of my grandfather's stories by the fire, the sweat I'd poured into every inch of fence line. They were erasing me without firing a shot. But soldiers don't quit, they adapt, they endure. And as I folded that letter and slid it back into the envelope, I made a silent vow. If the HOA thought a few signatures could defeat me, they had no idea what kind of man they were. Provoking. I'd fight their papers with steel resolve, their bylaws with the discipline of a soldier. I didn't know how yet, I couldn't fight them from the desert, but I knew one thing: when I came home, I wouldn't be alone. Because soldiers don't fight wars alone. We fight as a unit, as a brotherhood. And one day soon, that brotherhood would come home with me. For now, though, all I could do was shoulder my rifle, pull my helmet down tight, and keep pushing forward into another day of blistering heat and shifting sand. But beneath it all, the war waiting back home burned hotter than any I fought overseas. And in that desert silence, I swore an oath to the ranch and to my family name. They could take it on paper while I was gone, but when I returned, I'd reclaim it in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Coming home is supposed to feel like waking up from a nightmare, stepping back into the life you left behind, breathing air that doesn't reek of diesel or gunpowder. They tell you it'll be familiar, comforting, like slipping on an old pair of boots. But for me, stepping off that plane was like walking into someone else's life, a cruel impersonation of the home I'd carried in my chest through every firefight and sleepless night overseas. The first thing that hit me was the smell, cleaner, greener than the desert air I'd breathed for months. Texas had its own perfume. Cut hay, mesquite, distant cattle, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes and makes you feel whole. I closed my eyes on the tarmac, letting it soak in. My boots touched American soil, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe everything I'd endured had been worth it. I was home. The drive from the airport should have been a victory lap. My sister picked me up in her old pickup, the one I'd fixed up years back, still rattling like a loose toolbox. She tried to smile, kept glancing at me as if making sure I was real, but her hands gripped the wheel tighter than they should have. I asked her about the ranch. She hesitated, changed the subject, asked about the desert, about my buddies, about anything but the land. That hesitation was the first crack. My gut told me something was wrong, but I forced myself to look out the window, to believe that when we turned down that familiar dirt road, everything would fall back into place. But it didn't. The ranch gate, my gate, the one my father welded from steel pipe when I was a boy, was gone. In its place stood a shiny wooden sign carved with some ridiculous suburban development name, Sunset Acres Community. My stomach dropped. The barbed wire fence lines had been replaced by split rail decoration fences, the kind you see in brochures, pretty but useless. Where pastures should have stretched wide and free, there were neat patches of manicured lawn dotted with garden gnomes and identical mailboxes. It was as if someone had gutted my home and dressed it in a Halloween costume. "Stop the truck," I told my sister. My voice was calm, but inside, my chest burned like a furnace. She pulled over, her lips pressed tight. I stepped out and walked toward what should have been my front yard. A stranger's car sat in the driveway. My barn, had been painted beige, stripped of its soul. And my house, the house I'd grown up in, the one where my father taught me to tie my first rope, where my mother hung quilts in the windows, was occupied. Curtains drawn, toys scattered across the porch, laughter floated from inside, light and easy, as if they belonged there. I froze, staring at it all, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. Every mile I'd marched in combat boots, every drop of blood I'd spilled overseas, I carried it home like armor. But in that moment, I felt naked, vulnerable, betrayed. Then the HOA president appeared. Same wiry frame, same 2 white teeth, khakis pressed like he ironed them twice. He strolled up with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won, clipboard in hand like it was a weapon. "Ah," he said, his tone syrupy, "you must be the previous owner." Previous owner. The words cut deeper than any bullet I'd taken. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, trying to decide whether to laugh, punch, or both. He chuckled nervously, though his eyes glittered with smugness. "You were absent quite a long time. The community couldn't just let the property fall into disrepair. The auction was perfectly legal, all by the book. You understand, don't you? Rules are rules. Rules are rules." That phrase echoed like gunfire in my head. Rules that stripped me of my birthright while I fought for their freedom to sip lattes and argue about mailbox heights. Rules that sold my legacy out from under me. My sister started to speak, but I raised a hand. I needed to hear this man, needed to taste every ounce of his arrogance before I decided what came next. He gestured to the rows of cookie-cutter houses sprouting where my cattle once grazed. "Look around. This is progress. Families. Order. A community we can all be proud of. Your rustic operation just didn't fit the vision. My vision blurred with rage. Rustic operation, that operation, fed families, built generations, carried history thicker than any bylaws. My voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, dangerous. That was my land. He smiled, like a teacher correcting a slow student. Now it belongs to the community. The word community tasted like poison. I wanted to tear that clipboard from his hand, to drive it into the dirt, to make him understand that land isn't just bought and sold like trinkets on a shelf. But combat teaches restraint as much as it teaches violence. You don't strike unless the target matters. And this man, as smug as he was, wasn't the real target. The system he hid behind was. So I turned and walked back to my sister's truck. She watched me, eyes full of apology, maybe even guilt. But I wasn't angry at her. She'd done what she could, fought where I couldn't. This wasn't her war, it was mine. As we drove away, I looked back at the ranch. Strangers, children played in the yard where I once tumbled with my dog. A sprinkler spun lazily across the grass where cattle should have been feeding. The house was alive with light, but to me, it looked hollow. Like a body without a soul. That night, I sat in my sister's kitchen, the same table where we once spread out homework and Sunday dinners. Now it was cluttered with envelopes, all stamped with the WA logo, all full of threats and demands. She explained everything. The hearings I couldn't attend, the meetings they scheduled knowing I was gone, the way they used my absence as proof of neglect. She tried to fight, but they brushed her off, called her uninvolved, said the owner, me, was unreachable. They used my service, my duty, as the very excuse to strip me of everything I owned. I listened, silent, as the anger solidified into something harder, colder. This wasn't just loss, it was theft, and it wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. I'd faced enemies with rifles, men who wanted me dead, but at least they were honest about it. These people, they hid behind paperwork, smiling while they gutted my life. And that kind of enemy, smiling thieves in khakis and pearl earrings, was far more dangerous. When my sister finally stopped talking, I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. My voice was quiet, but every word carried steel. They think I won't fight back. She swallowed hard. Can you? I met her eyes. I'm a soldier. Fighting is the only thing I know how to do. But this wasn't the desert. This wasn't a battlefield I understood. This was a new kind of war, one fought with lawyers, loopholes, and signatures. I'd need allies. I'd need strategy. And as much as I hated it, I knew I couldn't do it alone. Still, as I sat there, watching the stack of letters like they were enemy intelligence reports, a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Because the WA had made one fatal mistake. They thought they were fighting a lone man, weakened and worn from war. But I wasn't alone. The army doesn't leave its own behind. And soon, the ranch wouldn't be the only thing reclaimed. The ranch was gone, stolen from me with paperwork and signatures, but what the WA didn't understand was this: soldiers don't surrender. We regroup. We adapt. We strike back. That night in my sister's kitchen, staring at the mountain of WA letters and legal documents, I knew I couldn't win this war alone. The battlefield had changed. No rifles, no sandbags, no armored convoys, but the enemy was the same at its core: arrogant, organized, convinced they held the power. And that's the kind of enemy I'd been trained to dismantle. The first call I made was to Ramirez. He'd been my mechanic overseas, a grease-stained wizard who could coax a Humvee back to life with nothing but duct tape and profanity. He picked up on the second ring, his voice thick with Texas drawl. "Cowboy," he said. "Nobody else called me that." "Yeah, brother," I answered, trying to keep the fire out of my tone. "I'm back, and I've got a problem." He didn't need details. Where and when. That was Ramirez. Loyalty wasn't something you earned with him, it was automatic. Still, I told him the story, every ugly detail about the WA, the auction, the smug president with his clipboard smile. Silence hung on the line until Ramirez finally muttered, "Sounds like you've got yourself a war back home." "Exactly." He laughed, low and sharp. "Then it's about time we started fighting it." Next, I called Daniels, the lawyer. Back in uniform, he'd been the quiet guy, always reading in his bunk while the rest of us joked and cursed. Turned out, before the army, he'd gone to law school, practiced a bit before swapping courtrooms for combat zones. When I explained the situation, he didn't laugh. He didn't even sound surprised. "They use the same tactics in court that insurgents use in the field," Daniels said calmly. Overwhelm you with confusion, drown you in paper, make you believe you're already defeated. But trust me, most of it is smoke and mirrors. We can burn them with their own rules. I could almost see his thin smile on the other end. Send me everything, every letter, every notice, every fine. They left a trail, and trails can bury people. Then there was Big Mike, our tactician. He wasn't actually big, 5'8", wiry as a fence post, but his mind was sharper than barbed wire. He'd been the one to plan patrols, map escape routes, and turn impossible missions into survivable ones. When I told him about the HOA, he snorted. So let me get this straight, he said. You've got civilians playing war with bylaws. Exactly, he chuckled. Oh, this is gonna be fun. Within a week, my kitchen table transformed into a war room. The envelopes and notices became intel reports, spread across the surface like battle maps. Ramirez leaned against the fridge, chewing sunflower seeds and muttering about civilian stupidity. Daniels sat hunched over the paperwork, highlighting phrases with surgical precision. Big Mike paced the room, sketching diagrams on scrap paper, arrows pointing to choke points, lists of weaknesses. It was the same energy we'd carried in combat zones, the same unspoken bond, only now the enemy wore polo shirts instead of uniforms. We began small. Recon. Ramirez and I attended an HOA meeting, slipping into the back row like we were infiltrating enemy territory. The board sat at the front, Smug behind their folding table, papers stacked like fortifications. The president droned on about community standards, while residents nodded like sheep. Then came the part about fines, violations, and foreclosure authority. I watched their faces, arrogance everywhere. They thought they were untouchable. Afterward, Ramirez whispered, these clowns wouldn't last a day outside this building. But Daniels was more serious. They've overreached. I can already see inconsistencies. Illegal enforcement, fraud, even. They think nobody's paying attention. He tapped his folder. We'll make them regret that. Big Mike's plan was more creative. We can't just beat them in court, he said one night, grinning like a fox. We've got to beat them in morale. Undermine their confidence. Make their little empire crack before the first gavel hits. He wasn't talking about violence, he didn't need to. Soldiers know better than to bring rifles to a schoolyard fight. But psychological warfare, that was second nature. We started attending every HOA meeting, every open session. We asked questions, loud, inconvenient questions they couldn't answer. We recorded every word, every smug smile, every contradiction. We rallied neighbors, many of whom had quietly suffered under the HOA's tyranny. Once they saw soldiers standing up, they found their own courage. And it worked. Cracks began to show. Board members squabbled among themselves. The president's voice lost its smug lilt, replaced by irritation. Daniels hit them with formal legal requests, demands for records they didn't want to share. Ramirez, accidentally, parked his mud-splattered truck across the HOA president's pristine lawn during one meeting, smiling wide when the man fumed. Big Mike organized the neighbors, drafting petitions, staging small protests. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't the hunter, it was the hunted. But the real turning point came when we exposed the money. Daniels combed through the books like a bloodhound. What he found made even him whistle. They've been funneling dues into private accounts, he said, tapping the numbers. Trips, cars, you name it. They've been stealing from their own members. That was our artillery strike. We didn't just have a legal case now, we had the kind of ammunition that could blow the HOA's credibility to pieces. We leaked it carefully, not recklessly. Quiet conversations with neighbors, anonymous flyers slipped into mailboxes, whispers at the grocery store. By the time the next meeting rolled around, the board walked into a crowd that wasn't nodding politely anymore. They were angry, demanding answers, and in the back, we sat with arms crossed, watching the empire crumble from within. The president tried to keep his composure, insisted it was all standard procedure. But when Daniels stood up, cleared his throat, and recited chapter and verse of the state statutes they'd violated, the room erupted. Yelling, accusations, panic. That night, walking out of the community center, Ramirez clapped me on the shoulder. Told you, cowboy, they don't know who they're messing with. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. We'd rattled the cage, sure, but the wall wasn't finished. Cornered animals lash out, and I could see in the president's eyes that he wasn't going down without dragging others with him. Still, for the first time since I'd come home, I felt something dangerous in my chest, not just anger, not just grief. Hope, because now I wasn't fighting alone. My brothers were back at my side, the same men who had carried me through firefights and sandstorms. And together, we were going to reclaim more than my ranch. We were going to reclaim every house they'd stolen. They called it a neighborhood dispute, we called it a siege. When you take a stand against people who think bylaws are bullets, things get theatrical fast. The HOA tried to frame us as troublemakers, soldiers who'd come back with too much temper and not enough manners, but manners don't fix a stolen legacy. So we stopped playing along with their script. We took the fight to the places where their power lived. The gate, the meetings, the public record, and, when necessary, the front porches of every house they'd claimed. We turned the ranch back into a rally point and the community center into a courtroom and a stage. What followed wasn't a firefight with rifles, it was a war of presence, pressure, and truth, and soldiers are trained to excel at all three. The first morning of the operation, Big Mike called it, Phase 1, Occupy Normal. It sounded silly on paper, but you could see the logic when the sun rose. We rolled up before dawn in pickups and a couple of borrowed flatbeds, the kind of vehicles that had seen worse roads than these manicured cul-de-sacs. Neighbors poured out of houses in pajamas and slippers, blinking at the unfamiliar sight of so many veterans carrying coffee and clipboards instead of rifles. We set up camp beside the old gate, now a memorial of sorts, a rusted reminder of what had been lost, hung a banner that read, simply, "We're home," and started talking to anyone who would listen. Talking turned into listening, and listening turned into organizing. People who had shrunk under HOA fines for years found their voices again when men in uniform stood beside them and asked the right questions at the right volumes. We compiled lists of violations, notarized witness statements about the auction, and collected photos, old family portraits of children on porches that were now occupied by strangers, deed books that showed a lineage the HOA had ignored. Ramirez became the outreach officer by sheer force of personality. He could charm an angry neighbor into signing a petition faster than anyone could say, bylaw. Daniels handled the legal filings, moving like a surgeon through injunctions, stay orders, and discovery requests. He forced open records the HOA had hoped would remain buried and subpoenaed bank statements that revealed how dues had become perks for board members. The law, when swung by someone who knows how to use it, can be an enormous and very loud hammer. The HOA tried to respond with its own arsenal: letters demanding we vacate, private property, threats of fines, calls to the sheriff. They painted us as vigilantes. It was rich, soldiers who'd followed orders for years now being labeled lawbreakers by men who'd broken trust for sport. The sheriff came by once, polite but firm, and listened to our side. He read Daniel's filings and frowned. "You've got a good case," he said, quietly, the kind of sentence that feels both like mercy and a loaded weapon when you hear it in uncertain times. He left with a hand on my shoulder and a warning: keep it peaceful. We promised. We always keep our promises. Peaceful occupation, however, can be exhausting to those who built their lives around complaint forms and inked signatures. The HOA's members retaliated in petty, obvious ways, calling code enforcement on Grass Heights, reporting noise violations when we held town hall-style meetings, trying to cut off our access to certain shared facilities. They dredged up every technicality they could find, like magpies collecting trinkets. But for every petty jab they made, the community dug in deeper. People brought casseroles to our makeshift camp. Kids chalked the road with messages of support. A retired schoolteacher started a donation jar for legal fees. The ranchers' fight became a neighborhood revival. Resentment transformed into solidarity. The turning point was public humiliation, and we planned it with a soldier's sense of timing. Big Mike had an idea born from too many field operations and not enough sleep: show the people, in public, what the HOA had done. We arranged a public records reveal right outside the community center, tables with printouts, a loudspeaker, rows of folding chairs. Daniels presented the documents like evidence at a trial, pointing to transfers and invoices, naming names. The HOA board showed up in force, their president with his perfect teeth facing down neighbors who were no longer intimidated. A video camera streamed the whole thing. Someone uploaded it within the hour. Within a day, social media lit up with the story, local channels picked it up, outraged comments poured in, and suddenly the men who'd thought themselves untouchable had to answer to more than a few angry homeowners. Pride, once inflated, is easily punctured by light. With momentum on our side, we pursued legal remedies with a precision that surprised the opposition. Daniels filed for temporary injunctions to halt any further sales or alterations to properties under dispute. The judge, after a careful review and an unflattering look at the HOA's bookkeeping, granted a restraining order that froze many of their actions. It didn't hand us victory, but it did stop the bulldozers. It turned the legal tide just enough for the human tide to swell. Neighbors, now confident, started coming forward with statements about intimidation tactics and falsified notices. One woman produced a photograph of a forged signature on a notice she'd never seen before. Another admitted she'd been paid to sign paperwork she didn't understand. The web the HOA had woven began to unravel, and every pull revealed another thread. Of course, the president didn't go quietly. He lashed out with lawsuits, countersuits, and as much bureaucratic heat as he could muster. In the courtroom he played the role of the wronged administrator, trembling voice and righteous posture, while we sat in the gallery and listened. But Daniels and the evidence were relentless, and the scars the HOA had hidden were exposed one by one. The board's charisma vanished under the glare of documents and testimony. Even some of their staunchest supporters in the neighborhood began to question what they'd been told. One of the most moving moments came not from legal victory but from simple restoration. We found an elderly couple, the first owners of one of the houses that had been claimed, who'd been pushed out because they didn't understand the avalanche of forms. They invited us back into what had been their living room. Dust lay like quiet on the surfaces, but the photograph frames were still fixed on the mantel, ghosts of family breakfasts and late-night prayers. Ramirez and a group of volunteers carried boxes back into the house, replacing beads of dust with blankets and plates. The woman pressed my hand and whispered, "You boys brought us back." It was more powerful than a judge's signature. By the time the HOA realized the tide had turned, neighbors had begun reclaiming parcels through legal channels, through public pressure, through outright refusal to comply with illegal demands. Property liens were challenged and, in many cases, vacated. The community center, once the board's fortress, became a place where angry homeowners demanded transparency. The president's flights were exposed, the treasurer's offshore purchases were revealed. One by one, the pillars of their power disintegrated. Still, there were narrow, ugly skirmishes. Board members desperate to maintain control tried to enlist county officials to evict families, to enforce fines that had no legal grounds, to paint our actions as criminal. There were late-night threats left on porches, anonymous and cowardly. But each attempt to intimidate only hardened the resolve of those we had roused. When law and conscience aligned, the final blows came not from violence but from the relentless application of truth, document after document, eyewitness after eyewitness, community after community. When the judge finally ordered a full audit and nullified the auction that had claimed my ranch, the feeling in the air was electric. People gathered at the gate, not with pitchforks, but with folding chairs and thermoses, waiting for the day the land would be finally, legally returned. We had done more than stop a sale, we'd exposed a system that preyed on absence and used it to justify theft. We'd shown that when people stand together, when expertise meets courage, paperwork can't override the moral law. Walking back through my land that afternoon felt unreal. The grass still bore the marks of strangers. Lawns, trenches where irrigation lines had been installed, flowers where feed bunks should have been, but the fences were up, and the gate, our gate, stood where it always had. I ran my hand along the beam and felt the grain of wood my father had touched, and for the first time since I'd returned, I allowed myself to breathe. The war at the gate had been brutal in its own way, tiring, infuriating, and expensive, but it had been clean. It had been ours. People asked later whether revenge had ever tempted me, whether it had been sweet to watch the HOA's empire crumble. It wasn't revenge, not in the way they meant. It was restoration. It was proof that some things are worth standing for, that rights earned with sweat shouldn't be stripped by signatures. And as soldiers, as neighbors, as men and women who'd refused to be quiet, we reclaimed not just the ranch but a piece of what it means to belong. The morning the papers came through, it was quiet. No fanfare, no trumpets, no victory parade down Main Street, just a single envelope slid into my mailbox with the county court's seal pressed onto its face. Inside was a ruling, stamped and signed, that voided the auction, overturned the deeds, and restored ownership to every family wrongfully stripped of their homes. My ranch was mine again. My neighbors' houses were theirs again. On paper, it was just ink and legal phrasing, but in my hands, it felt like the weight of justice finally materialized. After years of silence, loss, and exile, the land had a voice again. I didn't read it twice. I didn't need to. Instead, I folded it once, tucked it into my chest pocket, and drove straight to the old ranch gate. The others were already there, Ramirez leaning against his truck, chewing on a sunflower seed stem like he'd been born in that exact position, Daniel sitting on a cooler with folders still stacked at his side, neat even in victory, Big Mike pacing like a caged dog, muttering about logistics for the return operation. Behind them, neighbors gathered, some holding kids, some holding banners, all holding their breath for what came next. I swung out of the Lexus, no, their Lexus, because that damn WA had paraded around in luxury while our land lay chained, and I walked to the gate. I ran my hand across the wood, scarred and sun-faded, but still standing. Just like us, cowboy, Ramirez said with a grin. You ready for this? I nodded. My throat was too tight to answer. Reclamation Day wasn't something you schedule, it's something that grows out of months of anger, planning, and sweat. The neighbors had made it a holiday before the ink was even dry. Trucks and flatbeds lined the road. Families brought boxes, furniture, photo albums, pieces of their lives they'd been forced to scatter when the WA ripped them out of their homes. Kids carried toys, men carried lumber, women carried casseroles in foil pans like the resurrection of a community required both nails and nourishment. We started with the ranch. My ranch. The locks, installed by strangers, were cut with a single snap of bolt cutters Ramirez carried like a sidearm. When the gate creaked open, the crowd cheered. It wasn't the kind of cheer you hear at a football game. It was rawer, heavier, like the sound of something deep inside finally breaking free. Inside, the land waited. Grass grew tall in places it shouldn't, fences sagged, the barn roof bore scars of neglect. But it was home. Every step across that dirt was a memory. The smell of feed, the sound of my father's voice, the rhythm of a life I'd thought stolen. I knelt down, scooped a handful of soil, and let it fall between my fingers. You're back, I whispered. And for the first time since I'd returned from overseas, I felt like I was too. The neighbors followed suit. One by one, families reclaimed their houses. Kids burst through doors to find bedrooms still painted in their favorite colors. Couples wept in kitchens that had been silent for years. An old man kissed the frame of his front door. It wasn't about furniture or walls, it was about belonging. The WA had tried to strip that away, but belonging doesn't die, it just waits for the right moment to roar back. Of course, the WA board wasn't there. Their empire had collapsed weeks earlier, resignations, indictments, a string of lawsuits waiting to crush them like an avalanche. The president who once strutted through meetings with his polished clipboard now faced fraud charges. His house, ironically, was one of the ones repossessed. Daniels joked that it was poetic justice, but I didn't laugh. Poetic or not, it was justice. And justice was enough. As the sun climbed, the day turned into a festival. Someone set up grills. Kids chalked the pavement with words like, free, and, ours. A preacher from town said a prayer over the land, voice breaking as he thanked God for restoration. Soldiers, civilians, kids, old folks, we all sat together, eating burgers off paper plates, watching fences go back up and laughter echo where silence had ruled. But it wasn't just about celebration. It was about what came next. Big Mike stood on the flatbed of a truck, clapped his hands for attention, and launched into a speech like he was briefing a platoon. This isn't just about winning, he said, eyes scanning the crowd. This is about building. We've seen what happens when we let a handful of people hold the reins. Never again. From now on, this community decides together. We don't need an HOA. We don't need overlords. We need each other. The crowd roared in agreement. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shook hands. Plans for a new community council, informal, volunteer, transparent, took root right there in the dirt. Daniels volunteered to write up the structure, nothing fancy, just a way to keep everyone's voice equal. Ramirez promised to fix every broken fence post on the ranch, free of charge, because damn it, wood and nails I can handle better than bylaws. Big Mike offered strategy, as always. And me, I just listened. For once, I didn't need to lead. The land was leading us. By evening, the sky turned gold, painting the reclaimed houses in firelight. I sat on the porch of the ranch house, boots up on the rail, watching the last of the families carry boxes inside their doors. Ramirez plopped down beside me, passing over a cold beer. Not bad for a bunch of old soldiers, huh? Not bad at all, I said, taking a swig. Daniels joined us, holding a file thick with papers. The fight's not completely over, he warned. There'll be appeals, counters, maybe even more. Lawsuits. But they can't win. Not now. We've got the law, the people, and the story on our side. Big Mike stood leaning against the porch post, looking out at the horizon. Stories are stronger than fences, he said quietly. They keep people together when everything else falls apart. He was right. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was the story of neighbors who refused to be broken. The story of a community that rose when pushed down. The story of soldiers who came home and refused to let the battlefield end at foreign borders. As the stars came out, I pulled the court ruling from my pocket and laid it on the porch rail. The ink gleamed under the porch light. It wasn't just words. It was a marker, a line drawn in history, proof that no matter how deep the loss, reclamation is always possible. The war was over. The ranch was home. The houses were back where they belonged. And in the quiet Texas night, with my brothers beside me and the land stretching out under a blanket of stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Peace. True, unshakable, hard-earned peace. Months passed, and the seasons changed the land back into what it had always wanted to be, alive. The fences stood straighter now, patched by Ramirez's calloused hands. The pastures grew even and green, cattle grazing where weeds once ruled. The houses that had been hollow shells of someone else's arrogance were lit from within again, windows glowing at night with laughter and dinner smells. Every driveway carried its own story, every porch its own history, and for once, nobody dared threaten that with fines or letters. I walked the ranch one last time at dusk, boots pressing into soil that remembered my father, my childhood, and the silence of the years I'd been gone. The gate loomed ahead, the same one the WA had tried to claim, the same one Ramirez had snapped open like cutting a vein. It had been rebuilt now, stronger, sanded, and sealed, but still the same wood, still the same spirit. Neighbors were gathered beyond it, kids darting around with sparklers, couples leaning against trucks, a few vets sitting on tailgates, trading stories that belonged half to war and half to home. Big Mike had organized a community cookout, the first of many, no doubt, and the air was thick with mesquite smoke and the low hum of voices rising together. Daniels found me leaning against the gatepost, the ruling tucked under my arm like it had become part of me. "You gonna frame that thing?" he asked. "Thought about burning it," I said. "It served its purpose. Don't need to keep the enemy's paper when I've got the land itself back." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Only you would turn a legal victory into kindling." Ramirez ambled over, sunflower seeds cracking between his teeth, and clapped me on the back. "You know what this is, cowboy. This is the part of the movie where the camera pans out, music swells, and everybody lives happily ever after." "Don't jinx it," I said, but I couldn't stop smiling. The truth was, there were still loose ends. Lawsuits pending, appeals clogging the courts, and bureaucrats who'd try to find new ways to claw at us. But they didn't matter anymore. The community was awake now, and once people remember they have power, you can't put them back to sleep. As the sun sank, painting the sky orange and violet, I pushed the gate closed behind me. It clicked shut, solid and final. For years, that gate had been a symbol of loss, locked against me, chained by strangers. Tonight, it was a symbol of return. Not just for me, but for everyone. I thought of the old woman who kissed her front door when she came back. The kids who ran into their bedrooms shouting like they'd found buried treasure. The men and women who once hung their heads at HOA meetings, now standing tall in the middle of their own land. That was the real victory, not a ranch reclaimed, but dignity restored. Big Mike's voice carried from the crowd, booming like he was briefing soldiers again. "Eat before it gets cold," he hollered, "and someone get cowboy a plate before he gets sentimental and ruins my appetite." Laughter broke out, rolling across the pasture, and I felt something shift inside me. Overseas, victories were measured in miles gained, objectives secured, lives saved. Here, victory was measured in laughter, in fences mended, in houses full again. It was quieter, but no less sacred. I lifted my beer in a silent toast to the sky, to the men I'd served with who couldn't come home, to the families who had endured, to the land itself. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next battle. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't preparing for loss. The war was done. The ranch was whole, and as the stars sparked alive over Texas, I let myself believe in something simple, something steady, something mine. Home.